In this story, we're going to travel, not in the restless, hurried way people do today, but slowly through time and through the unfolding of human curiosity. This is the story of how we began to see the world, how we learned to draw it, how we mapped the unknown. Before there were satellites and glowing blue dots showing where we are, there were hands stained with ink and dust, compasses made of polished brass, and minds trying to make sense of where one land ended and another began. The history of mapmaking isn't only about geography. It's about imagination, about fear, wonder, and the quiet need to belong somewhere specific on a vast, uncertain planet. So tonight, as you listen, imagine the slow rhythm of a quill scratching across parchment, the creak of wooden ships, the steady breathing of someone working late into the night, trying to measure the immeasurable. Let your mind drift gently to the time before the world was mapped, when the edges of the known were wrapped in cloud and legend, and the world was a mystery waiting to be drawn. Segment 1. The shape of the known world. Part 1. Before the maps. How ancient people saw their world. Imagine standing on a high hill, somewhere in the ancient world. The air is warm, thick with the scent of dry grass and smoke from distant hearths. Below you, a village rests in a gentle haze. Mud walls, low rooftops, and beyond them, the soft curve of the horizon. To the people who lived here, that horizon wasn't a border of the earth. It was a mystery, a question. What lay beyond it? More land? A vast sea? A void? For most of human history, people didn't think in terms of continents or oceans. They thought in directions that mattered to survival. Toward the river, beyond the forest, across the mountains. Their world was made of paths, not planets. When we say map, we think of lines and coordinates, but early humans mapped their surroundings in other ways, through stories, songs, and memory. In Australia, the Aboriginal songlines are a striking example. Each song is both a creation story and a map. By singing it, one could travel across the land, guided by verses that describe the shape of hills, the color of stones, the direction of the wind. The land was alive with information, stored not on paper but in rhythm and voice. In the Arctic, the Inuit shaped maps out of driftwood, carved reliefs of coastlines that could be read with the hands during snowstorms or darkness. Imagine fingers tracing the grooves, identifying the curve of a bay or the break in an ice shelf. These maps weren't drawings, but touchable worlds. And in ancient Mesopotamia, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates shaped early civilization, the first known map was etched into clay. It dates from around 2300 BCE. The lines are rough, the symbols simple, a small city surrounded by circles that may represent mountains or water. Yet, for the person who made it, that small clay tablet must have felt like an act of control over chaos. To draw the world was to claim a piece of it, to turn uncertainty into something known. If you picture a scribe in Babylon, bent over the clay, pressing marks into it with a reed stylus, you might imagine the silence of the room, the glow of an oil lamp, the faint hum of the city outside. The scribe wasn't thinking of exploration or conquest. He was recording the world as he knew it, a world that revolved around the familiar, the sacred, and the immediate. For many early cultures, the Earth was not seen as a planet at all, but as a kind of disk surrounded by water or heavens. In Egypt, the world was sometimes imagined as a long river, the Nile, flowing from the mountains of mystery into the sea. Everything that mattered happened along its banks. In Greece, poets spoke of Okeanos, a vast circular river surrounding the known lands. Beyond it, the unknown. And in every ancient myth, there's a quiet echo of fear and awe for what lay off the edge. To sail too far was to invite disappearance, to step beyond the gods' protection. There's something gentle about that kind of ignorance, I think. The comfort of believing the world ends just past your field, your village, your temple. No need to imagine continents or hemispheres, just the local, the immediate, the sacred circle of daily life. In the towns of Sumer, people mapped their surroundings by the position of temples and canals. In China's early dynasties, maps were drawn on silk and bronze, In the Americas, the Maya carved cosmic maps onto stone, mixing astronomy with geography. The sky, the land, and time itself were parts of the same system. These were not maps for travelers. They were maps for meaning. Each culture looked outward and saw itself reflected in the pattern of the world. The Babylonians placed Babylon at the center of all things. The Greeks would later draw the Mediterranean as the heart of civilization. The Chinese called their land the Middle Kingdom and saw it as the axis of heaven and earth. This belief, that we stand at the center, seems universal. It's comforting, perhaps even necessary, to think that where we are is where meaning resides. You can almost imagine those early mapmakers drawing the world as they believed it to be. A circle of land surrounded by endless water, marked by mountains, rivers, and myths. Maybe a serpent at the edge. Maybe a god. In the dim light of their homes, they drew not the world as it was, but the world as they felt it to be. And in that small act, scratching lines into clay, silk, or stone, humanity took one of its first steps toward understanding itself. Part 2. The birth of measured space. Picture a coastal city somewhere around the 5th century before our era. Maybe it's Miletus, or Alexandria, or one of those Mediterranean harbors where voices echo between white stone walls and sails flap softly in the wind. Merchants arrive from distant lands, their ships heavy with grain, silk, spices, ideas. And in the crowded markets you can hear languages folding into one another: Greek, Phoenician, Egyptian, Aramaic. It was in places like these that the art of mapmaking changed forever. Trade demanded precision, philosophy demanded order. And so, the world began to shrink, not physically, but conceptually. Imagine one of those early thinkers, perhaps Anaximander of Miletus, around the year 550 BCE. He's often credited with creating one of the first true maps of the world known to the Greeks. No longer a mythic disk guarded by gods, but a flat circle of land surrounded by ocean, divided into known regions: Europe, Asia, and Libya. He didn't draw monsters at the edges, only ignorance, and that alone was revolutionary. To draw what you don't know honestly without myth, just empty space, that's a kind of courage. Soon after him came Hecataeus, refining the world's outlines with more care, and then Herodotus, who traveled to Egypt and Persia and tried to fit stories from different lands into a coherent geography. Herodotus listened, observed, wrote, and sometimes doubted. He described rivers, deserts, and cities, often admitting when he didn't know something for certain. That blend of curiosity and humility was rare, and in that gentle admission, "I do not know," there's something deeply human. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel what it must have been like to hold one of those early maps. A circle of parchment, faded lines showing the Aegean, the Nile, the far-off lands of Scythia. Maybe a name scrawled along a river, a temple drawn at a city's heart. Not an exact guide, but a reminder that the world was wider than one could see. As time drifted forward, the Greeks grew more ambitious. By the 3rd century BCE, Eratosthenes, working in the Grand Library of Alexandria, measured the earth itself. He knew that in one Egyptian city, Syene, the sun at midsummer stood directly overhead, no shadow at all. But in Alexandria, on the very same day, shadows fell at an angle. So he measured the angle and the distance between the two cities, and used simple geometry to estimate the Earth's circumference. And he was right, astonishingly close to modern figures. Imagine that. A man who had never left Egypt calculating the size of a planet. It is one of those quiet moments in history that feels almost sacred, like someone lighting a lamp in the dark and suddenly seeing the edges of a vast, round world. Eratosthenes also made maps, of course. He drew latitude lines, imaginary horizontal lines crossing the world, and vertical ones too. The beginnings of a grid that would later define navigation and geography. With him, the world gained shape and proportion. Then came Ptolemy, centuries later, building upon that foundation. In his book Geographia, he gathered every known map and description he could find, cities, mountains, coastlines, and translated them into a mathematical system. Latitude and longitude, degrees and coordinates. It sounds ordinary now, but back then it was an act of pure abstraction. No longer was the world drawn as it looked, but as it could be measured. To look at a map from Ptolemy, time was to see the Earth as if from above, something no human had ever done. Even now, when you glance at a globe, you're looking through Ptolemy's eyes. His grid still defines the way we understand the surface of our planet. In other parts of the world, parallel revolutions were happening. In China, mapmaking had already become a refined state art. During the Zhou dynasty, bronze plates were inscribed with tiny reliefs of rivers and cities. By the time of the Han dynasty, maps were drawn to scale, accurate depictions of regions and borders. The Mawangdui silk map, unearthed from a tomb sealed over 2,000 years ago, shows roads, rivers, and settlements in astonishing precision. It's delicate, painted with thin lines of black and red, showing not just geography but administration, governance, the heartbeat of an empire. You can imagine the silk unfurled by lamplight, the brush of ink drying slowly, the faint scent of pigment and smoke. To the mapmaker, each line was a way of understanding not just where things were, but how they related. The land, the power, the flow of people and grain, all linked. Across the ocean, in the Americas, similar minds were at work. The Aztec codices, folded books painted on deerskin, contained symbolic maps of territory and trade routes, but also cosmic directions. East wasn't just east, it was the place of birth, of sunrise. The center wasn't just a location, it was the axis of the universe. All over the world, as if guided by an invisible thread, humans began translating the intangible into form. The Earth was no longer an infinite mystery, but a shape that could be drawn, measured, and maybe even known. Still, there was something poetic that lingered in those early maps, a kind of reverence. Even when the grid appeared, when numbers and degrees defined the Earth, the sense of wonder never completely vanished. At the edges, cartographers often left blank spaces or wrote in delicate ink, terra incognita, unknown land. And sometimes they drew not monsters, but flowers, not warnings, but beauty, as if to say, even in knowledge, there should be mystery. Part 3. The Expanding World. Explorers and the Age of Discovery. Imagine a harbor in the early 15th century. The air is heavy with salt and tar, the slow sway of ships tethered to wooden posts, and the murmur of men preparing for voyages longer than any before them. The world feels wide and unfinished. For centuries, maps had been drawn from stories, what travelers said they'd seen, what priests thought must exist, what astronomers measured from afar. But now people began to sail to those faraway places themselves, to prove or disprove what the parchment claimed. It was a time of great faith in the human eye. If you could see it, you could map it. And if you could map it, you could own it. But before Europe's explorers set sail, much of the real progress in cartography had already come from the Islamic world. After the fall of Rome, when many classical texts were lost to the West, scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba preserved them, translated them, improved them. Under caliphs like Al-Mamun in the 9th century, astronomers measured the Earth again using Ptolemy's principles. They placed long rods in the desert and watched the movement of the sun, calculating the planet's circumference with astonishing precision. From this environment emerged Al-Idrisi, a 12th century cartographer working under King Roger II of Sicily. His Tabula Rogeriana was a marvel, an immense detailed map drawn not from speculation, but from data gathered across 3 continents. He interviewed merchants, sailors, and scholars, merging their knowledge into a single image of the world. Rivers flowed accurately. Mountains were placed in roughly the right positions. Cities were named and organized by region. If you held the map today, you might be surprised. South is at the top, north at the bottom. But that's how many Islamic maps were drawn. The world inverted perhaps from the way we imagine it, but conceptually the same. The precision of his work was extraordinary for its time. And yet when Al-Idrisi finished, he didn't describe his map as complete. He called it a mirror of the world. Something reflective, not definitive. There's something beautiful about that. Acknowledging that every map is an interpretation, a reflection of who we are as much as where we are. As the centuries turned, trade routes shifted, and power moved westward again. By the late 1400s, the Mediterranean could no longer contain human curiosity. Portuguese ships began creeping down the coast of Africa, mapping it as they went. Each cape, each current, each unknown island was slowly recorded. On their maps, drawn on animal parchment and called portolan charts, coastlines shimmered with accuracy. They were drawn not from theory, but from the sea, from the feel of the wind, the angle of stars, the sound of waves echoing against land unseen. Lines called rumb lines radiated across them, geometric webs that guided sailors by compass, connecting ports like the threads of an invisible net. These charts were practical tools, but they were also works of art, painted in color, decorated with flags and compass roses. A captain could look down at one and almost hear the ocean's breath between the lines. And soon even the idea of the world began to change shape. In 1492, Columbus set sail not to find new lands, but to reach old ones faster, to cut through to Asia by going west. He believed the earth smaller than it truly was. And when he found unfamiliar shores, he thought they were the edges of India. Cartographers struggled to adjust. They copied, erased, redrew, and each time a new land appeared, the old maps became ghosts, fragments of belief overwritten by discovery. It was during this period that a German mapmaker named Martin Waldseemüller, working in 1507, made a quiet decision that would echo forever. On his vast printed map, he labeled a newly depicted continent across the ocean as America, after the explorer Amerigo Vespucci. It was the first time that name appeared. A small act of naming, but one that redrew not just geography but identity. Every new voyage reshaped the idea of the world's limits. Magellan's circumnavigation proved that the seas were connected, that the earth was indeed round, vast, and continuous. When his surviving crew returned in 1522, their maps were no longer filled with gaps or monsters, but with coastlines, islands, and measured distances. The world was coming into focus, and yet, the more it was mapped, the more people realized how much remained unseen. In Asia, Chinese and Korean cartographers were also refining their own grand visions. The Cognito map of 1402, for example, depicted the known world from East Asia's perspective, China at the center, Europe and Africa compressed to the west, distant but present. It combined ancient Chinese knowledge with information carried along the Silk Road, blending science, trade, and myth into a single image. To the Korean scholars who painted it, it wasn't about conquest or ownership. It was about harmony. To understand the world was to live rightly within it. Even now, when you look at such maps, you can sense their balance. Rivers curve like veins, mountains rise like vertebrae, cities pulse along trade routes. The earth feels alive, one great organism connected by the flow of people and time. The explorers may have claimed to be discovering new worlds, but in truth, they were discovering the limits of their own understanding. Each coastline traced was a correction. Each island found a quiet admission of how much had been missing. And somewhere, in a candlelit study, a mapmaker's hand trembled slightly as he inked a new continent into existence. The world was no longer imagined, it was being witnessed, measured, named. And yet, even as the lines grew sharper, the mystery remained, waiting just beyond the horizon. Part 4. The Art and Authority of the Map. Candlelight flickers across the walls, and the air smells faintly of wax and old paper. On a wooden table lies a great sheet of vellum. Its surface gleams faintly under the quill's slow movement. A man leans over it, tracing the outline of a coastline he's never seen with his own eyes. Outside, the world is expanding faster than anyone can quite comprehend. Ships cross oceans in months, empires rise and fracture, and the skies themselves are being measured by new instruments, telescopes, sextants, and compasses of brass. Yet here, in the stillness of that room, the mapmaker works in near silence, shaping the world on paper. By this time, maps had become instruments of power. A line on a page could decide ownership of a continent, draw borders across rivers and forests that had never seen a European footprint. Each map was both a record and a claim, an act of vision and an act of control. Still, it wasn't all conquest. Many mapmakers were driven not by empire but by wonder. They wanted to understand how the Earth curved, how the stars aligned, how the winds moved across the globe. The Dutch Golden Age produced some of the most beautiful maps ever made. Cities like Amsterdam became centers of cartographic craft. If you imagine stepping into one of those workshops, you might hear the rhythmic rasp of engraving tools against copper plates, the soft smell of ink, the faint hiss of paper being pressed flat. Maps rolled out like silk banners, full of delicate color, pale seas washed with blue, coastlines rimmed in gold. They were not just charts but art pieces, meant to be hung on walls and admired. A family might stand before one, pointing at distant lands, dreaming of the Spice Islands or wondering what kind of people lived beyond the edge of their known world. The beauty of those maps came partly from what they didn't show. The white spaces, the uncharted interiors, were left blank, a gentle silence between lines. They whispered of deserts, jungles, and civilizations unseen. In many ways, the white spaces were the soul of the map. They reminded people that the world was still larger than their reach, that there were still mysteries left to explore. At the same time, scientific precision was growing. Astronomers like Tycho Brahe and later Kepler refined celestial measurements, giving navigators new confidence. The stars became coordinates. The heavens turned into tools for earthly travel. By the 18th century, with the invention of the marine chronometer, longitude could finally be measured accurately at sea. It was a quiet revolution. Before that, sailors often knew how far north or south they were, but not east or west. A single clock changed everything. The maps that followed were cleaner, sharper, and colder in a way, less mythical, more mathematical. Gone were the dragons and sea monsters. In their place appeared neat grids, numbered lines, and careful legends. Yet even these scientific maps held a kind of poetry. They captured the moment humanity began to see itself as part of a vast, measurable universe. Not the center, not the chosen circle, but a point among many. In East Asia, cartography continued to flourish on its own terms. Japanese maps of the Edo period, for example, often blended geography with artistic style. Mountains looked like folded paper, rivers curled elegantly across the surface. They were meant not only to guide, but to please the eye, to remind the viewer that beauty and knowledge need not be separate. In Islamic lands, ornate celestial charts continued to be produced, some drawn in shimmering inks, others etched on polished brass. They reflected a belief that to understand the heavens was to understand divine order. Each star, each line, a reflection of balance. Maps everywhere became mirrors, reflecting not only the planet but the people who made them. A European map from the Age of Empire centers Europe. A Chinese one of the same period centers China. A Persian one orients south at the top. Each says quietly, "This is how we see the world." There's something deeply human about that tendency, to place ourselves at the center, to draw the world from our own viewpoint. But as exploration continued, as communication spread, a subtle shift began to happen. People started to understand that perspective itself could be mapped too. Think of a globe turning slowly, its curved surface catching light. No center, no top or bottom, just continuous motion. For the first time, people could imagine standing anywhere and calling it the middle. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, maps had become common objects, folded into atlases, stitched into books carried by travelers and scholars alike. Children traced them in schools. Explorers marked their routes. And quietly, the dream of a fully mapped world began to feel within reach. Yet even then, there were still regions left untouched by ink. The deep interior of Africa, the frozen heart of Antarctica, the dark floors of the ocean, the last frontiers, and perhaps even now some part of us misses that feeling, that sense of edges, of mystery beyond the line. Because once the whole world was mapped, something invisible was lost, a certain kind of wonder, a certain kind of dreaming. But the maps themselves remain, each one a frozen moment in time, showing not just geography, but the mind of an era, The rhythm of curiosity, the pulse of empire, the calm devotion of those who drew what they could see and guessed at what they could not. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear the faint scrape of a quill again, a whisper of parchment rolling flat, the soft breath of a cartographer exhaling after finishing a line. The world, at last, had form, but its mystery somehow endured. And with this, we will end our first episode. Stay tuned for the next episode of Map Making History. Thank you for watching.